Hello and welcome to Chopper's Election Podcast. I'm Christopher Hope, the Telegraph's chief political correspondent, back in the warmth and comfort of the Telegraph's audio studio next to our newsroom after 3 weeks of this.
Labour's manifesto is a manifesto for hope.
And this.
You know, he doesn't want to be Prime Minister, he wants to be Prime Ditherer, ladies and gentlemen.
And this.
A Liberal Democrat majority government will revoke Article 50 on day one.
Yep, we've seen the slogans, we've heard the soundbites, we've scrutinised the leaflets, but have you read the party's manifestos in full? Well, we have. And joining me today for a special Manifestos Unzipped episode of Chopper's Election Podcast are three colleagues who've been through the detail with a fine Telegraph tooth comb. And they're here to tell you what the parties are actually promising. And hopefully they'll bring some much-needed clarity before you cast your vote now, because postal votes can be cast, or on December the 12th. That's right, today on Chopper's Election Podcast, I'm joined by our political editor, Gordon Rayner, who'll be giving us the full detail of the Tory offering, by Harry Yorke, the expert on the Labour Party for the Telegraph, and Danielle Sheridan, who knows everything about the Lib Dems. And I'll be talking about Nigel Farage and his limited promises in the Brexit Party manifesto. Morning, everyone. How are you?
Very well, thanks.
Hello.
Gordon Rayner, to you first. This is the Brexit election. What's Boris Johnson saying about getting the UK out of the EU?
Well, unsurprisingly, Chris, he says that Britain will leave the EU by January the 31st next year. He also says that the trade deal will be completed by the end of 2020. Interestingly, he doesn't threaten to leave with no deal at the end of 2020 if he hasn't agreed a trade deal. That's because he has said in the past that there is absolutely zero chance of Britain leaving the EU without a trade deal at the end of 2020. But interestingly, the Tories will only have until June to really sort of get the nuts and bolts of a trade deal nailed down, because they then have to decide whether they want an extension or not. So he's obviously said they won't extend, but what their manifesto doesn't say is that if they don't extend, we will leave without a trade deal. So
it's get Brexit done, sort of.
Yes, well, it's very much a case of if he gets a majority, which is obviously the whole point of this election, then he will be able to go through with all of his promises, because he will have the MPs to do it. So obviously, in manifestos, political parties don't talk about what they might not be able to do. So not a huge surprise. But clearly, he wants this to be all about Brexit, and the other parties don't particularly want it to be all about Brexit. But notable that the Tory manifesto is not at all big on other promises. It's very much, he wants to keep it on Brexit. He hasn't made any other really big promises, and certainly nothing that was unexpected or out of the ordinary or novel that people can pick apart.
It's quite a left-wing document, isn't it, in the sense that the pledge to lift the tax threshold of high earners from 50,000 to 80,000 has been dropped.
Yeah.
There's more spending.
Yeah.
It's got a bit of a Lib Dem feel, I think, Gordon Rayner.
Well, people have compared the Tory spending promises with the Labour spending promises, and clearly their Tory spending promises are totally dwarfed by what Labour is saying they would do. But even then, he is suggesting a 1.1% increase in the size of the state, which would be the biggest increase in the size of the state under the Tories since Macmillan. So in that sense, yes, certainly very liberal. Lots of spending, despite the fact that it's not as big a spending splurge as Labour are promising. Interestingly, whereas Labour have said they're going to do lots of things, but not necessarily said how they're going to pay for it, the Tories have said they're going to spend £100 billion, but not said what they're going to spend it on. So
infrastructure and things? Or?
Well, we don't really know. I mean, they've allocated £22 billion of the £100 billion that they've said they would borrow, and that is on infrastructure. These would all be on capital projects. But he's given the Chancellor or any future Chancellors £78 billion to play with over the next 5 years, which one would imagine means that he can make lots of statements about perhaps, I don't know, bridges to France, bridges to Ireland.
Royal yachts, Gordon Rayner.
Maybe that as well.
We live in hope.
It certainly doesn't say there's not going to be a royal yacht. And
Correct.
Every conversation we have with ministers, Chris, as you and I know, they certainly are very much.
But they're loath to say it. They let us.
They don't want to say it,
and take the heat.
But they definitely don't want to say that it's not going to happen.
Do you think that there's no mention there of a pledge to review or look again at the fox hunting ban passed by Tony Blair in 2004 or 2003, but came in force in 2004? Is that an indication of a shift away from its historical grassroots, rural grassroots, literally grassroots base?
Well, I don't know. I think one of the things that the Tories were desperate to achieve with this manifesto was to not do anything that would either scare off any voters or give Labour and the Lib Dems attack lines. And I think they know that fox hunting last time around, it was unpopular with some voters. It gave Labour and the Lib Dems a chance to say, the Tories only care about killing foxes, they don't care about benefits and all that sort of thing. So I think they're just very deliberately leaving out anything that might prove controversial because he just needs to get that majority.
And grammar schools aren't there at all. They're a feature of the 2017 election.
Left out grammar schools, as you said earlier, left out the pledge that he made during the leadership campaign to increase the threshold of the higher tax band from 50 to 80,000. He's concentrating on lower earners instead. So it's a very sort of plain vanilla manifesto that is, it's very hard for the opposition parties to really get their teeth into and attack the Tories.
Because he can do this, can't he? Because faced against the huge statism idea that the heart of Labour's manifesto, which we'll come to in a minute with Harry Yorke, you can see why they're taking the chance to be a bit more left of centre if they can be.
Yeah, I think one of the themes of this whole election campaign, as with any campaign, is the economy and the fact that the Tories will say over and over again, Labour can't be trusted with the economy. History shows that Labour will just leave the country virtually bankrupt, and then the Tories will come in after Labour, clear up the mess, and then the whole cycle starts all over again. And this is a theme that the Tories are very keen to keep pressing home to the electorate. And the fact that Corbyn has promised extraordinary amounts of spending and borrowing, 600 billion, 1.2 trillion, pick your own figure. It means that really the Tories, by promising to not do an awful lot, are actually making a virtue of that by saying, look, we're the safe pair of hands here.
He's quite lucky, Boris Johnson, in that sense, isn't he? To have an opponent who is so clearly different to what the Tories can offer.
Yeah, I think it's been very clear throughout the last, ever since he became Prime Minister, that he was very, very keen to have an election where his opponent was Jeremy Corbyn because he was confident that he would beat Corbyn. I think if Labour had a more moderate leader, a Keir Starmer or somebody of that ilk, then it might be a different election because they can't, one of the key attack lines for the Tories is that Jeremy Corbyn is such an extremist, you just can't trust him.
Harry Yorke, to you now. You come straight from another Labour press conference, and they even called you for a question today, which shows they suddenly are quite keen on Telegraph again.
A rare opportunity. I'm not sure about that, no.
But it struck me reading your Tory manifesto at the weekend. There were around 60 mentions of Brexit and just 21 in the Labour one. I mean, Brexit, although it's a Brexit election, it's not a strong area for the Labour Party, is it?
Labour is trying to avoid talking about Brexit altogether, really. If you look actually in the manifesto, it is, I think, 3 pages are devoted to Brexit. And the reason why that is obviously because it's been harming them for months, this ambiguity over Brexit. Now, it wasn't in the manifesto, but Jeremy Corbyn clarified for the first time the other night that he's going to remain neutral. But obviously, many of his shadow cabinet are going to campaign for Remain. So that's one of the reasons. The other reason is Labour don't want to be going into an election, and certainly not in the north of England, their kind of strongholds, with immigration being a major issue. So what they've done in the manifesto is they've effectively parked this row over freedom of movement. So
what's the policy on that?
Well, it's a good question. It's fudged is the answer. So what they've done is they've said, if Britain, because obviously they want a second referendum, and their whole policy is they negotiate a new Brexit deal in 3 months, and then 6 months, after 6 months, we have a second referendum. Now, in the event that we remain in that second referendum, you don't have to worry about freedom of movement. They're not going to try and reform it because we're staying in the EU. If we leave, that's a different scenario altogether. So what they've said, basically, is they've said, we're saying we will negotiate a new arrangement, but they're not taking freedom of movement off the table. They actually say we recognise the benefits that freedom of movement.
So it could carry on if we're
Absolutely.
allied to the customs union.
Absolutely, yeah. And look, if you speak to people in Jeremy's inner circle, in Jeremy Corbyn's inner circle, they will be a little bit more reluctant to say that. But if you speak to shadow cabinet ministers, I do, if you speak to some of the kind of pro-Remain voices around that table, they are very much of the view that it may well be the price that they have to pay.
Yeah. I mean, away from Brexit, I'm struck by this document about just the sheer scale of statist intervention. I mean, it is going to reverse 40 years of progression towards more private enterprise involved in the government's work. I mean, what's amazing is that if Brexit Party has given this country a near political nervous breakdown over the past 3 years, I mean, what Labour's planning to add to that is just extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, could you just sketch out for us the scale of the land grab by the state under a Labour government?
I mean, there's no doubt about it. Labour wants to reverse not just the last 10 years, they want to reverse the last 40 years. So we're talking New Labour, but actually going for as far back as Thatcher. So there's a lot of talk about Thatcher, and you'll have seen that over the last 2 weeks. So we're talking about privatisation, the reversal of privatisation, a vast sweeping renationalisation.
Which areas are we going to be privatising?
We're talking about rail, mail, water, and actually a little bit of energy as well. So we're talking about some of the distribution network, and with they were talking about nationalising the big 6 companies. They decided that was too complicated and probably, even by Labour standards, a little bit too expensive. So what they're saying is that actually the firms that send you your bills, they'll nationalise those instead as a compromise.
Okay. And you haven't mentioned, I think, BT Openreach.
Oh, sorry
BT
about
Openreach.
That. Yeah, no, and
list.
there's so many of them. But yeah, BT Openreach is a big contentious issue. And the reason why that is because John McDonnell allegedly reassured BT earlier this year that they weren't part of the programme. In fact, he was asked about this several months ago, and he said, they don't feature in our plans. And then, lo and behold, we get to the election and they do feature.
And other areas too, is private landlords, do they get... Is that right to buy being dropped now?
So that has
renters?
been dropped. So this is another thing to say about the whole manifesto, is it's not as radical as some people thought it was going to be based on Labour's conference. So with right to buy, what John McDonnell was proposing was that private tenants would effectively be able to force their landlords to sell to them. That would obviously have a massive impact on the private rental market.
Yes.
There's a lot of concern. But that was dropped. And I am told by people inside the party who deal with this policy area that it was actually coming up on the doorstep. So all candidates, at least, were complaining about it because, it is unpopular. There is also an issue with the fact that there are a lot of landlords who do vote Labour because it is a they do increasingly have a middle class vote.
And there's a few dog whistles in there on public schools, isn't there? Is that stayed
Yeah,
in?
no, again,
Has that gone away?
Well, to an extent. So at Labour conference in September, they had adopted a motion which effectively said we're going to abolish private schools. It was called the Abolish Eton campaign. And what they wanted to do was redistribute the assets of the schools, integrate the schools into the public system. That hasn't actually filtered through into the manifesto. John McDonnell was worried about it. Angela Rayner was. It's an unnecessary faff. What they're saying is they're going slightly further than 2017. In 2017, they were saying, we'll impose VAT on student fees. They're going to scrap charitable status altogether for private schools. So that means business rates and VAT.
Yes.
Now, that's a big problem for a lot of private schools. The ISC, the private schools body, has warned that this policy would lead to lots of kind of middling private schools closing.
Who are not the big one, like
Yeah,
Eton will
exactly.
survive, it's the smaller ones.
Exactly.
And just finally there, what wasn't in there, I thought quite striking, was the weekend briefing on the 60 billion for WASPy women, which is half the NHS budget. It wasn't even priced up in there, wasn't even in the manifesto or priced again, and that goes to the heart of, the manifesto is meant to be a kind of holy writ in elections that can't be fiddled with, it can't be touched. That's why dementia tax was such a big issue for Theresa May, because they couldn't rewrite the manifesto.
It is a big problem. So you have this grey book, which John McDonnell takes so much pride over, this costed grey book with all of their costing and policies. And it's not supposed to change, as you say. But what they ended up doing is what seemed to be on the hoof. They announced this £58 billion package for WASPy women.
Yeah.
And they weren't really very clear about where the money would be coming from, but we now understand from what Jeremy Corbyn has said is it would be partially funded by government reserves, but mostly through borrowing. So there's another, 10, 20, 30 billion pounds of borrowing.
Is that a full figure or an annual figure or over 5 years figure?
It's 58 billion over 5 years. And the other problem with that is, apart from the fact that it raises questions about the credibility of the manifesto, if you're having to throw a load of extras in, the other problem is that this is effectively, it's not means tested. So it goes to everyone. And as people were pointing out the other day, if you actually look at Labour's own calculator for WASPy women who were born in the 1950s, Theresa May stands to gain about £22,000 from this. And in fact, Princess Anne, who
is she getting money?
She's getting £2,000. So, that really will crystallise in voters' minds when they think about this policy.
Yep.
Hang on a second. should
Well, it
this
goes to the
be
point of giving everything to everyone.
going to everyone?
So when they want to offer everyone free broadband, then many people who can afford it will pay for Virgin or whoever the provider is or BT. Why do they want the state one? Why are we paying twice for our broadband effectively through taxes and personally?
I mean, in the interest of balance, there is a problem with full fibre broadband in this country.
Yes.
It's been too slow, the rollout, compared to other countries.
But the issue is rural areas. Anyway,
it is, yeah.
We'll come on to that. Danielle Sheridan, how are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Straight from Woman's Hour. Thank you for spending time on your media round this morning to come on Chopper's election podcast.
It's a pleasure.
The Liberal Democrats.
Yes.
Now, Brexit. That's their big selling point on the doorstep is Brexit, isn't it?
Yeah, the idea of revoking Article 50 is pretty much how the Lib Dems...
Just stopping Brexit altogether. That's it. All over.
Stopping Brexit is how they've been able to kind of realign themselves as a party that's no longer seen as a bit of a joke. I think people are seriously wanting to vote for them in the hope that getting their local MP to switch to Lib Dems would mean a softer Brexit. I mean, I don't think anyone's delusional enough to think that Lib Dems could potentially win this thing.
Well, the revoke policy is based on her becoming Prime Minister, isn't it? If that fails, they'll campaign for a second referendum. So
exactly.
There's two policies that are slightly at odds with each other depending on the outcome of the election.
Yeah, and I think Jo Swinson has come to recognise that as well. I mean, she was presenting herself as a potential Prime Minister, and she's kind of rode back on that narrative slightly. So I think the public know that a vote for a Lib Dem MP in their constituency is more a vote towards getting a softer Brexit.
But isn't her saying at I think in one of the debates last week that the Tories are going to win the election a way of trying to make the Tory vote soften and give you permission to vote for the Lib Dems because Corbyn's not going to happen? Do you know what I mean? It may be a clever idea.
Yeah, I think that's a really valid point. I think Jo Swinson knows that the Tories are probably going to win this. And so by her saying, as you just said, it positions herself in a way that might make potential Tory voters swing her way if they want a soft Brexit.
And what are the key policies in there? I mean, they're quite tax heavy, are they?
So they are saying that basically if you vote for Lib Dems, the average person is going to have an extra £173 on their income tax each year that the party would be in Parliament,
right.
Which is, I personally think, fairly minimal. And they're saying this amount of tax would be ring-fenced to go towards the NHS. And that would, improve hospitals, encourage freelance working for members of the NHS, free up more hospital appointments. They are going quite hard on what they can do in terms of improving the NHS.
And on freedoms, are they quite soft on drugs, aren't they?
So I thought it was quite funny
soft on soft drugs.
So they refer to, Chris, it depends what you think about cannabis being soft or not, but they refer to to Labour and Conservatives of having a prohibitionist attitude towards weed, and they want to legalise it with particular focus for medicinal purposes. So people that have rheumatism or cancer or whatever it is that can have their pain eased by smoking.
It could be an
cannabis.
idea the government might adopt in the future, a different government. But of course they were strong in the coalition of raising the personal threshold, which is now seen as all parties' government policy. So.
And another really good policy is that they are the only party, and perhaps because they know they're not going to get into power, but they want to raise free childcare up to 35 hours for working parents. When Jo Swinson was the Employment Relations Minister, she introduced, she worked on shared parental leave, which she sees as one of her big achievements under the coalition. And in her manifesto, she wants to increase the amount of free childcare time from 30 hours to 35 hours. And this would kick in for working parents from the child being 9 months old, i.e. when a mother would finish her maternity leave and return to work. And then it would continue from non-working parents from 2 till 4 years old when the child goes to school.
How do you think Lib Dems are being seen by the electorate, given their massive boast at the beginning? Aren't they kind of stuck with a policy of revoking which made sense in September and makes little sense in November? Yeah,
they have contradicted themselves throughout this campaign, which I think is tough for them. And it doesn't help that polling shows Jo Swinson isn't as popular with the voters. So I think they have a bit of work to do in terms of their image and what the party really stands for. And perhaps they should have been clearer from the beginning that actually what they're campaigning for is a people's vote, rather than saying with a simple letter we can revoke Article 50.
I think it felt wrong when they announced it in the Bournemouth conference.
Yes.
And you were there, weren't you?
It was announced by Ed Davey, yes.
It
on the
felt
first
confusing
day.
then because of a two-track policy, and it feels even worse in the White Heat of an election campaign.
I agree.
Well, talking of shrinking parties, it's my great privilege to be given the Brexit Party to cover by Gordon Rayner, sitting next to me. Yet again, for the fourth election in a row, I'm following Nigel Farage, and this manifesto was much smaller than before. It's about the size of half an A5 piece of paper.
It wasn't a manifesto at all, Chris, was it?
It wasn't really.
Didn't even call it that.
I did tweet the famous line from Sunset Boulevard, "I'm still big, but the manifesto's got smaller," as Nigel Farage waved it around.
He called it a contract, I think, didn't he?
He called it a contract with the British people. I mean, in there, it's basically an attempt at pressuring the Tory party into be more Tory than they are at the moment. So one idea I thought was quite interesting was having people who can afford private healthcare should have a tax break to pay for that and then not use the NHS to take the burden off it. That, of course, might develop into a two-tier NHS, as I'm sure Labour would say. But there's a degree of different thinking. They're going to review HS2 like the Tories are. They're going to revisit universal credit, which is what the right would like to do within the Tory party. There's other areas such as support for fishing and coastal communities, which is basically bigger, 2.5 billion, than the Tories are already planning to do. They want to plant millions of trees, and in fact, it was a bit more than that in the press conference, because Nigel Farage said he wanted to see the government lead a global campaign to plant hundreds of billions of trees.
There's been an arms race over trees, hasn't
I mean,
there,
trees
Chris?
is a big area.
Yes. Every party has made a promise to plant X number of billions of trees, haven't they? And it's
nuts.
it's a case of who can plant the most.
I think people like trees, don't they?
Yes.
It's a nice way of saving the environment.
When I looked into this, I was staggered at how much room we've got for trees. I would have thought 30, 60, 100 billion trees would cover the whole country, but it doesn't.
Right. Yeah. And then the final thing I thought was interesting was on tax. They want to lift the first £10,000 of corporation tax to be tax-free, a bit like the personal allowance. And that made a lot of sense because there's figures out there showing that maybe 2/3 of companies are so small they don't even pay more than 10 grand in profits, and of course a lot of that is eaten up by the cost of having an accountant. So I thought there were areas in there which other parties might adopt, and of course the party really is only seeking to win maybe as few as 10 MPs.
Yeah. The problem they've got is that nobody sees them as a party of government or prospective party of government.
Well,
so
they literally can't be because they're not standing in.
Exactly, and so they can say pretty much what they want, can't they?
Yeah.
And none of it really means an awful lot, other than they may get one or two MPs who may be able to influence things if Boris doesn't get a chunky majority.
And they're developing a tactical voting app, which they think might be helpful. They're only standing in 274 seats, so they can't. Nigel Farage can't be Prime Minister in any decade soon.
Hi, I'm Katie Morley and I'm the Telegraph's Consumer Champion. It's a big job title, but what it really means is that I help readers who are being ripped off. I've heard from scam victims, people whose insurance won't pay up, readers who've been on horrendous holidays or been fleeced by car hire firms. You name it, I've dealt with it. And I've managed to win back over £800,000 for our readers in less than 6 months. It's not always easy though. I've spent hours on the phone arguing with companies and stepped in where the police refused. And time, as we all know, means money. That's where our subscribers come in. If you subscribe to The Telegraph, you're helping fund public service journalism like this, as well as great podcasts like Choppers. So, if you'd like to support what we're doing and to get unlimited access to the huge range of world-class journalism, head to telegraph.co.uk/chopper. You can get 30 days free access to The Telegraph online, and after that it's just £2 a week. That's telegraph.co.uk/chopper, or click on the link in the show notes to this episode.
Well, that's the Brexit Party sorted out. Let's throw it a bit wider into more of a general chat for the last 10 minutes of our podcast. Harry Yorke, who are the Labour Party targeting? I don't think it's readers of The Telegraph, is it?
No. Well, in some respects, yes. I mean, if a Telegraph reader earns under £80,000, then perhaps. But yeah, this is very much a manifesto rooted at the lower incomes and middle incomes. You know, the whole message of Labour's manifesto is if you earn under this much, if you earn under £80,000,
vote for us.
Yeah, vote for us, because we will give you better public services, better schools, better health services.
You may be worse off because they're scrapping the marriage tax allowance.
Exactly.
And there are areas around that which...
Exactly. That is a big problem for them, is they've pitched themselves as a party that will help anybody under that bracket of pay, but as Jeremy Corbyn was forced to acknowledge yesterday, in fact, they have got tax measures in their manifesto which will hit people on low incomes. In fact, as Andrew Neil pointed out, if you're paying into a private pension, because they're raising a dividends, they're raising the dividends tax, you'll actually end up paying £400 of extra tax if you have a private pension, and that could hit people on incomes as low as 14,000.
That's most workers.
That's a lot of people.
Not public sector workers, but most workers.
And also with the marriage tax allowance, that's £250, but that's for 2 million people, and that's for lower income. So, there are big questions there.
The message seems to be that if your dice isn't stacked in your favour, vote for the Labour Party, because they will literally chuck all the chips in the air and see where they land, won't they?
Yes, I think so. I think that's fair enough.
And Gordon Rayner, the Tory Party, do you think are they ignoring their base to go after left of centre voters, do you think, with some of their policies?
Well, I think they know that...
Who's Mondale man for them?
Yeah, I asked the Prime Minister this at the press conference when he launched the manifesto, that clearly by leaving out any promises that he made previously to sort of middle and higher income voters.
Tory members, you mean?
Yeah, he is, I think, look, there's no question he's taking some of those people for granted a little bit. They know that those voters are not going to vote for Jeremy Corbyn. They are pretty confident they're not going to vote Lib Dem. But I guess one of the key things we have to remember is that he's targeting Leave voters in this election. And we've seen, haven't we, over the past few months, that people identify more with Leave and Remain than they do with political parties. So it's a different kind of election in that sense. He wants to scoop up all of those Leave voters. He's seems to be doing a pretty good job of seeing off the threat from the Brexit Party. We've seen their poll ratings steadily falling away. So if he can avoid the Brexit Party splitting the vote, then he's going to be in pretty good shape. But so Leave voters, clearly traditional Tory members, but I think he is appealing to traditional Tory members more by saying, look, there'll be some tax cuts for everybody who is on, the vast majority of the income bands, and there won't be any massive spending splurges that are going to put the economy in threat.
And Danny Sheridan, what's the Lib Dem? Who's their target market? I mean, are they saying we'll keep the Labour Party honest in a new coalition deal, or I think they won't work with Jeremy Corbyn, will they? They won't support his government, is that right?
And Jo Swinson said categorically she would not work with either Boris Johnson or
so
Jeremy Corbyn. Well, I guess she might be thinking perhaps if Labour got a new leader, then perhaps she would be willing to work with the next leader. But that aside, in terms of who they're targeting, I think it's the London Liberal elite that didn't want Brexit.
And the South West too, a bit of the South West.
Yes, exactly.
They've also said, haven't they, that they'd rather force another election than work with Corbyn. So maybe you're right that their ultimate strategy is hung Parliament, Corbyn goes, have another election, and then see what happens then.
I think that's right. And in the last Q&A that Jo Swinson did, she cited anti-Semitism within the Labour Party as one of the reasons why she categorically couldn't work with Jeremy Corbyn. So, I mean, that's a whole nother issue to contend with. So
what's surprising, isn't it, Gordon Rayner, that there's a lack of clarity is of supporting Boris Johnson. He's saying to voters, vote for this party, will be out by the end of January. With the Labour Party, as Harry Yorke was saying, it's going to be 6 to 9 months of uncertainty. And with Lib Dems, as Danny Sheridan was saying, it's going to be uncertainty, either another referendum, another election. Who can she work with?
Yeah.
There's a degree of clarity with the Tory party.
Yes. Boris's phrase, which we're all going to be very, very bored of hearing, aren't we, by the end of this election, is let's get Brexit done. There is a lot of anecdotal evidence out there, I think, and some polling evidence that a lot of the population, whether they voted Leave or Remain, just want an end to this endless nightmare of not knowing where the country's going, and it's hitting investment, it's hitting jobs, or it certainly will do if it carries on much longer. And it's a very simple message, and I think it does work very much in the Tories' favour. They are the only party, aside from the Brexit Party, as we've talked about, they're the only party who are offering a quick end and decisive action to deal with Brexit. One of the things I think the Tories could make more of is that Boris has been saying that if you vote for Labour or the Lib Dems, you're going to have another year of chaos. Actually, I think it's more like 2 or 3 years more chaos, because they're not going to get 2 referendums, I don't think, within a year. It would probably be 2 years. So this would just carry on ad infinitum.
Harry Yorke, who do you think has had the best reception amongst all the band of manifestos? Because I think there's a big echo chamber, isn't there? On Twitter, everyone, all the Twitterati support the Corbyn cause, and elsewhere there's big support for the Tory cause. Do you think it's very hard to discern who's getting the best, who's winning the air war.
How do you judge it? So if you look at the Conservative, what was the intention of the Conservative manifesto? It was for nobody to talk about it, effectively. And have they
successfully pull out on a Sunday in Telford as
exactly, and has that worked? I'd say so, because not many people are talking about it. The Labour Party was all about, we want our manifesto to be out there being talked about. And if you look at polling today, YouGov polling, that's certainly the case. More people have been talking about the Labour manifesto. They've seen it. They've
what was
heard
the polling?
it.
Was about if you're aware of the policies.
If you're aware of the manifesto, if you've read it, because Labour credit their 2017 performance largely. A large part of that was exactly because it was exciting, because it was leaked. People wanted to read it. Now, the polling shows that people are reading it, and that might be good for their base. The problem is that if you look at the polling, the next question was, do you think any of this is affordable? And the majority of people polled said, no, we don't think it's, So I would probably say Labour slightly ahead, but there are big question marks.
Danny Sheridan, isn't the point there, as Harry Yorke alluded to, the Lib Dems would have been better off leaking their manifesto and being cross about it than actually publishing it? A leaked document would get more scrutiny than a published one.
Yes, I think that's a really good point.
But I think the other point that just to follow on from what Harry was saying, that the polling that we've seen so far suggests that none of these manifestos have moved the dial. There's been pretty consistent in the Tory lead being around about 10 points, give or take. And so in that sense, Labour seem to have failed, really, to make a huge impact with their manifesto. The Tories just wanted steady as she goes. They just wanted it to, keep that lead, stay as it was. And that seems to be what's happened so far.
And Danny?
One thing I would say is that not many people genuinely believe that the Lib Dems will get into power. Therefore, I don't think people have really scrutinised their manifesto. For anyone interested in the Lib Dems, it's not about what they're going to do for education, the NHS, it's about Brexit. As Gordon said right at the beginning, this isn't really about politics.
You haven't even mentioned the other parties, like the DUP, who their election manifesto could be something we're dusting down on December 13th if there's a chance of another deal, although it's unlikely given the Brexit deal is not what the DUP want, isn't it, Gordon?
Yeah, the DUP have been very clear that they don't like the Brexit deal. And frankly, if Boris Johnson doesn't get a majority, then I'm not quite sure where he goes from there. Probably he would have to have another election, assuming Labour and the Lib Dems and the SNP can't form a coalition between themselves. But
well, thank you for this excellent Manifesto Unzipped session of the podcast. I'm going to ask you one final question each. In one tweet, Harry Yorke, summarise the Labour Party manifesto.
Spend, tax, and spend a bit more.
Gordon Rayner, in one tweet, summarise the Tory Party manifesto.
Don't scare the horses.
And Danielle Sheridan, how would you summarise the Lib Dem manifesto?
Smoke weed every day.
On that note, Gordon Rayner, Harry Yorke, Danielle Sheridan, thank you for joining me on Chopper's Election podcast. Thank you to the podcast producer, Theo Laludis. And thank you for listening. Do subscribe to the show if you haven't already. Special thanks this week to www5934, who left us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and said they loved our chat in the pub with Jeremy Hunt. That was last week, but do go on and give us a listen if you haven't already. If you like this, do tell your friends, your colleagues, your fellow train passengers. Pass on the podcast. If you want to get in touch, do tweet us at Brexit Broadcast or email us choppersbrexitpodcast@telegraph.co.uk. If you're umming and ahhing over a Telegraph subscription, why not try 30 days of our content free of charge, telegraph.co.uk/chopper, where you can read much more from all of your favourite writers, including Gordon Rayner, Danielle Sheridan and Harry Yorke, of you've heard today. This week, I can particularly recommend a piece by Norman Lamont, the former Tory Chancellor, calling for a new attack dog to take the Tory message to the other parties. I'll put a link to Norman Lamont's comment piece in the show notes. But always buy your copy of the Daily Telegraph. It's brilliant. Until next time, cheerio!
Hello there, Telegraph podcast listener. My name is Tom Gibbs and I'm the host of our Audio Football Club podcast. If your desire for top football chat isn't sated, then may I please recommend the Telegraph's very own podcast about that subject. Audio Football Club comes out every single Monday and it features some of the best and brightest football minds in the country, taking in all the biggest stories from the Premier League and around Europe. Search for Audio Football Club wherever you get your podcasts, or follow the link in the description of this episode. Good things will happen to you if you do so.